Hello and welcome to Deprogrammed. I'm your host, Harrison Pitt, fellow at the New Culture Forum, contributing editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by my co-host, Connie Tomlinson, who is also one of the leading contributors at Courage Media, and our guest panellist this week, Connie Shaw, the External Affairs Officer for the Free Speech Union, who came to prominence recently, I think, when she was cancelled by Leeds Student Radio for her gender-critical views. Connie, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So let's talk about what's in the news today then. Dame Louise Casey's audit into the rape gangs, which was commissioned, the Pakistani rape gangs, or the grooming gangs topic in general, that was ordered by Keir Starmer in February as a way of sort of kicking things into the long grass, has prompted the Labour government into a pretty humiliating U-turn. She's gone against many of its best-loved, most cherished narratives. How did Starmer not see that this would be coming, Connor?
Well, I think they did, because when they got the report in their hands 10 days prior to making the announcement that they're going to have, well, they're saying it's a national inquiry, but it's 5 local inquiries with national statutory backing with a 3-year time period, which is a very technical way of saying we don't want a massive national inquiry. But they got it 10 days earlier, and there was reporting in The Sun ahead of it coming out that said that they were petrified that there was going to be civil unrest because of that which was contained within. I think that the febrile environment we exist in, because David Betts and Dominic Cummings keep doing the media round saying they're not listening to our warnings, guys, there might be ethno-cultural civil war here, maybe we should do something about it, has ratcheted the tensions up within 10 Downing Street to the extent where they're buying that hype. But one of the reasons why they were so petrified of there being civil unrest was, of course, because Louise Casey put in a paragraph about, well, actually, it turns out that lots of the asylum seekers and illegal migrants who've been crossing the channel in small boats since 2018 are now part of this extended family and clan grooming and trafficking network that's been operating in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale and Telford for decades.
That's right.
Now.
On page 86 of the report, it says, while the future outcomes of these investigations remain unknown and the number of live open cases into grooming gangs we had access to was limited, this is what the audit says, this audit noted that a significant proportion of these cases appear to have involved suspects who are non-UK nationals and or who are claiming asylum in the UK. So that's a pretty damning connection that had not hitherto been made so publicly as all that.
No, we already knew that. So this year, I think the vast majority of small boat crossers have been Eritreans and Afghanis, and the Centre for Migration Control's data for 2023 found they were 20 times more likely to commit sex offences than British men. Just so happens that new FOI data on the same day as the Casey report has come out has found that foreign nationals are again responsible for up to a third of sex offences committed against women and girls. None of those people needed to be in the country to commit those heinous acts that ruined the lives of thousands of women and girls. So all of those are important taboos that Casey has shattered, as was, of course, the ethnic and religious composition of the gangs. Of course, we have lots of homegrown white British predators who are not getting severe enough jail time and penalties as is. We can deal with those, but the government would, and MPs like Tessa Munt or even Home Secretary Yvette Cooper would usually deflect and say, well, there's just as many white perpetrators. This would get fed through to the likes of Emily Maitlis calling Rupert Lowe a racist. And Louise Casey said, no, the Home Office report in 2020 that was used to make this claim was bunk. There is no basis for the system claiming there is just as much a problem with white perpetrators in these gangs as there is with Pakistani perpetrators. It's not the case. And then she went through a bunch of data in Manchester and Rotherham and West Yorkshire that showed that, for example, in Rotherham, they're 4% of the general population, but 64% of perpetrators of this kind of crime. Puts it to bed straight away.
What do you think the Labour government's political calculations were in calling for this audit, which seemed pretty likely in advance to bounce them into this humiliating U-turn, Connie?
Well, I think at the start of the year, when obviously Elon Musk shared that section of that transcript from the case in Oxford, I really do think that Labour thought that this would go away, and I really don't think that they realised how much this would galvanise people. And I don't know how much of that is to do with the fact that so much of this political discourse, specifically on the right, is now on X, and it's unavoidable, and they're having to deal with social media in a way that they've never had to do before, especially since Elon took over. And it almost felt like, obviously we had MPs like Dan Carden standing up and saying that he wanted a national inquiry, and as far as I'm aware there were other MPs at the time who wanted to but chickened out of saying that they wanted it as well. I think it was just a pride thing because they're so resistant of reform's pressure, and obviously we've had the Island of Strangers speech as well. Everything they're doing is obviously giving in to reform But also, I do think that the Conservative Party have done an excellent job at pushing for this, although some of the way that they have been taking credit for this this U-turn that they're supposedly taking credit for in some emails sent to members is also questionable.
Well, not least because one of the points that is made in Dame Louise Casey's audit is that much of the data that the media were sort of gleefully amplifying, particularly the Home Office 2020 report into this, which was amounted to, Dame Louise Casey herself says this is based on porous, flawed data, and she struggled to find any justifiable methodology that was used in coming to the conclusion that it was a predominantly white problem, and that, I think, as she puts it in the report, she says that under Priti Patel's watch, when this Home Office report was published, the system has consistently failed to acknowledge the ethno-religious dimension of this, Casey says, and treating it as sort of biased or sensationalized media reports. It's somewhat rich for the Conservative Party to take credit for bouncing the Labour government into this report when it was under their watch that such flawed data was being used to try and hush up the whole process in the first place. Forgive the brief interruption. Now, don't eat breakfast until you learn about caloric bypass. Your breakfast is setting you up for the entire day to either gain weight or lose it. The term breakfast literally means to break your fast that you started the night before. About 4 hours after you eat dinner, your body switches from the nutrients we get from food to the stored glycogen we have in our bodies. Once glycogen stores are depleted, typically after 8 to 12 hours of fasting, the body shifts to burning fat for energy. Fatty acids are released from fat stores where they are converted into ketone bodies through a process called ketogenesis. Then, when you eat breakfast in the morning, the body starts the cycle again. This is where the caloric bypass comes into play. Dr. Gundry, a heart surgeon in California, learned that if you break your nightly fast with something called MCTs, or medium-chain triglycerides, you can actually keep burning fat throughout the day and use it for energy. But there are specific types of foods that contain these MCTs. Using this breakfast breakthrough, he was able to lose 70 pounds just through diet, and he did this in his 60s. You can find out all about it and his exact method by going to thehealthyfat.com/culture. That's thehealthyfat.com/culture. Or click on the link in the description box below. It is important to remember that everyone's body processes fat differently, and it all depends on your unique metabolic type, which is why in the video he released for my special viewers, he talks all about it. It really is quite fascinating and might change the way you think about health. Go to thehealthyfat.com/culture or click on the link in the description box below. Back to the video.
Yeah, especially when the Conservative Party didn't back Suella Braverman when she came out and launched the task force in 2023, which resulted, I think it was in 550 arrests and 4,000 victims protected in a single year, which is really good numbers. When in 2023 she wrote an article in the Mail saying that it was predominantly Pakistani men that were participating in these groups, the Muslim Council of Britain, via the Centre for Media Monitoring, which has written all sorts of slanderous reports against GB News, saying they have an unhealthy obsession with Muslims because, they just cover these stories. They filed an IPSO press regulator complaint, and even though it wasn't upheld, the Daily Mail still threw Suella Braverman under the bus, and now Braverman's come out and said, I don't want an apology, I want an apology on behalf of the victims for the fact that you used the Home Office report as a pretext to silence the sitting Home Secretary on a scandal that was unfolding. Now, I'm going to be uncharacteristically fair to Priti Patel and Sajid Javid here, because I'm not a fan of either of them. But Javid did launch the report and said, we're not going to shy away from the fact that it's Pakistani heritage men. And when he celebrated the conviction of a group of them, David Lammy said he was fanning the flames of the far right. Mastermind in chief, David Lammy. And then Priti Patel, when she was insisting the Home Office had to publish this report, now she didn't look too scrupulously at the contents because they cited, Dr. Ella Cockbain, who was the person that wrote for The Guardian, grooming gangs are mainly white men headlines in the report more than they did any other source. And they only mentioned the word Muslim once, and it was to do with the Muslim Women's Network, talking about how Muslim girls are most affected by this. Even though she didn't scrutinise the contents of the report, she was pressing for civil servants to publish it publicly when they wanted it to be internal. And when she was telling them to do this, that was when the bullying complaint was brought against her. So in fairness, they have tried to get the data out, even if it was in a cack-handed way, and it was insufficient. But I think you're right. They tried to take too much credit for this. Chris Philp at the press conference on Tuesday did a great job saying that we need, to hold people in public office that covered up for it in contempt. But I do think that Kemi Badenoch is kind of running away from the fact that she was Women and Equalities Minister and never spoke about this once.
She would say that it wasn't on her brief. And before January, where this all kicked off, she had spoken about it at conference and she had mentioned it, that this was something that she wanted to tackle. I don't take such a harsh view of the Conservatives as other people do, particularly because I think that in some ways, personally, as a member of the electorate, I would understand and have sympathy for the Conservative Party if they said, we are deeply sorry and of course we should have done something. There's no excuse for the fact that the data produced by these reports is inaccurate. However, we simply cannot ignore this anymore, and we had said that we wanted to deal with this, but the press that it got and the work of Charlie Peters and the amount of time that Kemi and Charlie have spent together covering this, Kemi being extremely open to giving and subjecting herself to very strong criticism. And at that press conference, she did say, look, I have apologised to the victims. The fact that the victims are sat there with her, I think is credit. But I don't think it is unfair or would be that bad, optics-wise, if the Tories just said, look, you are right, we didn't do enough. But no one can say that they're not aware of this now. And I think she did actually say on GB News with Charlie Peters yesterday, when she said Jess Phillips is the worst safeguarding minister we've ever had, she said that we simply did not realise the scale of this. Obviously, individual MPs or ministers are not the only people going over these reports that are coming out. I think on a personal level, everyone who's watched and seen and read the work on GB News in particular, and read transcripts that were circulating on X, I think on an emotive level, that's enough reason to get on with this. And that's why I think that the way that Labour has dealt with this is so contemptible, because they have all of the same information that every person in the country now has. Members of the public are not reading the Exeter inquiry or the J report in detail, for example, but we can all watch what's being broadcast on Channel 4 now or on GB News. So for Labour to, after the coverage, to still say it's a far-right bandwagon, that's why I simply can't hold the Conservatives to the same sort of... I don't have as much criticism of them as other people do, but I think that the way that Labour have dealt with this is really awful, particularly because of the attempt to continue suppressing people, their speech about it by calling them as jumping on a far-right bandwagon, or Lucy Powell saying that it's a dog whistle, the continuation of it after they can't hide from it anymore. And I know I'm repeating myself now, but everyone has access to all of the same information now, and all of the independent journalists who have investigated this, and they're still acting as though it's not an issue. And that's when it gets too far, when the general public are so aware on many issues that this government, particularly to do with free speech and this, the public is so aware now that the government they're not trying to hide the fact that they're trying to pull the cotton wool over everyone's eyes. So that's why it's so awful, I think, more so, in my opinion, than the way that the Tories have dealt with this.
The fractured political coalition that the Labour Party now finds itself straddling is very awkward, and I think it prompts them to speak outside of both sides of their mouths on this sort of question, because on the one hand you've got people like Yvette Cooper saying, no, we will take up the recommendations, we're going to be tough on this, we're going to introduce things like making sure that asylum seekers haven't got sex-related criminal records in their own countries. Why the hell was that not already a prerequisite?
Because Keir Starmer wrote the textbook for lawyers to apply the Human Rights Act to frustrate the deportation.
Indeed so. But on the one hand they try and sort of present this kind of tough-talking posture, but then on the other hand, as you say, they're still reluctant to tackle the issue fully, because they find themselves, on the one hand, wanting to maintain support from the sort of white working classes in the Labour heartlands, who are obviously not on the mere poor side of this dispute, and then they've also got to sort of maintain the ragged tapestry of multiculturalism, because that is at heart a Labour project, and they need to keep the minority voting blocks on side, not least in places like Birmingham and Yardley, which is Jess Phillips's seat. She only won that narrowly.
693 votes.
By 693 votes at the recent election, and she was being heckled by these sort of tin pot Islamists on the side.
No, just men. Just idiots.
Just men.
Correct.
Just men. And instead, what happens is, because there is this sort of sentimental attempt to be even-handed and to act as though, well, this sort of dreadful nightmarish conduct could come from any possible community.
Do you know, I think most people would say that there's no way that Jess doesn't sorry, I'd like to call politicians by their first name, so I know that there's no way that Jess doesn't realise that this is an issue, but she is obviously concerned about her constituency.
Indeed.
Obviously, there's that iconic photo or infamous photo of her sat there in a room for a Muslim community
that was Angela Rayner.
Oh, sorry, Angela Rayner.
Yes. Don't worry.
Was that? Oh God, that's.
I believe that was Angela Rayner, but no, it was Angela Rayner. It could have been any Labour apparatus.
Pretty much all of them have subjected themselves to these struggle sessions in one way or another.
Yes.
But ironically, in 2019, when there were protests outside a school in Jess Phillips' constituency, they were majority Muslim protesters protesting basically LGBT topics being taught in sex education. She was saying you can't use religion for your bigotry. So she was happy to call that out. And I know they're very extreme, different things, but she was happy to sit on a stage and say that then. So I was quite surprised to see her bravery. It's not really brave to do that then, but she's unable to highlight the fact that she knows this is an issue, but it's just simply too big of an issue for her to confront.
I think the problem is that their left liberal agenda forces them to be schizophrenic on this. I mean, because on the one hand, they want to, they subscribe to what Eric Kaufman would call this kind of left modernist position, that society is more jazzy, it's more progressive, it's more at the cutting edge of things if it's not stuffy and homogeneous, and if in fact there is a sort of multicultural mosaic that defines Britain. So on the one hand, she feels herself to be an ally of that project. On the other hand, many individual communities, as we're supposed to call them, within that mosaic do not themselves subscribe to a left liberal view of the world. And if they were ever to reach critical mass in this society in demographic terms, they wouldn't be allies of a sort of left liberal project. And so on the one hand, whenever these sort of these communities are imported in order to establish a regime in this country of a kind of multicultural mosaic splendor, but on the other hand, once they're here and they start pushing for things like cracking down on LGBT education in schools or taking a rather dim view of women's rights or imposing all sorts of speech codes, then the left find themselves on the retreat. So I think it's because of their ideological worldview that they find themselves inhabiting these schizophrenic positions. Because you're right, there are statements in the past where she seems quite tough, but she can't be consistent on the matter. None of them really can.
I think her inconsistency and her anxiety is also just driven by craven political self-interest, which is why you keep seeing her flit from position to position on these things. So Louise Casey said to Charlie Peters, the moment that catalysed for her belief in the need for a national inquiry was when she saw the government's reluctance to help Oldham with their local inquiry. So it was Jess Phillips' refusal to respond to Oldham, and when she did, she brushed them off and said, no, do your own local inquiry without any assistance, that started this entire thing. Then when Phillips couldn't make the entire story about her, and Elon Musk tweeting some mean tweets about her, with the assistance of the media. She did all the media rounds in one day saying, well, I'm actually the true victim here. When she couldn't do that, and then she tried to quietly shelve the 5 promised local inquiries, which caused such a headache for the government, they had to come out and reiterate their support for them the following day. And then during the announcement on Monday, as you can see in the background, and this is why I love cameras being in Parliament, right? She is sitting there just scrolling through tweets on her phone. Something that she finds funny catches her eye. She laughs, and then she remembers she's got to put on a show for the cameras, so her face becomes ashen and solemn and does lots and lots of nodding again. I think do not underestimate how much of this is driven by, yes, craven political calculations, but the fact that these people are just sort of bereft of any actual moral concern for the girls that they're supposed to be safeguarding. And so they're just being battered around by public opinion and the fact that they can't actually keep up with it because they have no principles.
It wasn't only the political class that proved fairly complicit in this culture of denial. And in Casey's report, there is a whole chapter titled "Denial," which is if you're going to read a chapter, that would be the one you would read. You can find it online. But we had Pippa Creer, I think she's the political editor of the Daily Mirror.
Guardian.
The Guardian nowadays.
Yeah,
it used to be the Daily Mirror. In any case, she was saying, the facts. A Home Office report in 2020 concluded a majority of child sexual abuse gangs are made up of white men under the age of 30. It found there wasn't enough evidence to suggest gang members more likely to be Asian or black than other ethnicities. We now know that to be completely wrong.
And she's deleted the tweet.
And she's deleted the tweet, which, thank goodness, we have internet sleuths gleefully screenshotting these things. You've already mentioned the fact that Ipsos Mori gave Suella Braverman a ticking. Sadiq Khan even demanded that Suella Braverman apologise for what we now know to be hate facts, not hate lies, but hate facts.
Wait, he demanded she apologise.
Yep.
But I remember in this year when Susan Hall asked him what a grooming gang was, he played hatchling and said, well, what do you mean by grooming gangs? As if he'd just been born yesterday.
Exactly.
So 2 years ago, very adamant Suella Braverman apologised for pointing out the problem.
Yes.
This year doesn't know what it is.
Correct. And we also had a do people remember this? That we had I think it was a sort of trans Lib Dem councillor who changed the title on Wikipedia.
Oh,
from
yes.
Grooming gangs in the UK to Grooming gang moral panic in the United Kingdom, and Wikipedia approved that change. And we also had Owen Jones saying, a Home Office report found that the majority of child sexual abuse gangs are made up of white men under the age of 30. All I was doing in the video, he's explaining his conduct in the previous video, was stating the literal facts of the matter.
But at the time, it even showed that Asian, and that means Pakistani, it's not Japanese businessmen doing this, perpetrators were overrepresented by a factor of 3 per capita.
Yeah.
But then again, we can't expect them to understand per
So
capita.
what Casey actually says in the report is there is a kind of lack of reliable national data on this. So almost any assertion made about the demographic composition of people committing these sorts of crimes will lack empirical foundation at the moment. But we can nevertheless piece together a plausible picture on the basis of 3 local jurisdictions that have been actually quite good, and she praises them for gathering data. Those are Greater Manchester, South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you and Lewis even broke some of that lately. Lewis Brackpool, you did a Freedom of Information request, and you managed to get some of the numbers from that.
Yeah, the numbers were passed along via an FOI to us from West Yorkshire, and we found that Pakistani and Asian perpetrators were overrepresented by a share of 2 to 4 times the population locally and nationally. Part of the problem was, as Casey also found in her audit, a fifth of all perpetrators had no ethnicity recorded, and Casey has found that 65% of perpetrators have no ethnicity recorded on a national level. This looks really suspicious because, of course, sex is recorded in pretty much all the cases.
Yes.
So if you can determine that, they're deciding not to write that down. And Casey herself said in one of the case files she found the word Pakistani tip-X'd out.
Yes.
So it's being deliberately withheld to ensure the British public maintains a positive opinion of the Pakistani enclaves that they're living alongside.
Did you see Louise Casey's interview on the newsagents?
Bits of it, yes.
I wasn't sure what to make of her comment that this will be a gift to racists.
Well,
she is too concerned with the second-order effects of this stuff, I think. She said the same thing in her Home Affairs Select Committee hearing. She put the same thing in the report. I think what she's trying to do, being very charitable to her, is play to the gallery of MPs who are still concerned about being smeared as far-right and racist if they engage in this. And their own side's been doing this for decades. I mean, Nick Lowell's being the best example. He puts out a tweet saying the government's doing great things on this when he was, again, as part of Hope Not Hate, smearing everyone, including Suella Braverman, as a far-right racist up until last year. So I think that she's trying to get everyone on side. But I do think the worry I would have, and I wager you share this too, is that by baking those concerns into the report on the framing, it makes people reluctant to investigate ethnic hatred and religion as motivating factors by the gangs themselves when they've been open about that being the motivating factor.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I do agree with you that it's still this erring on the side of caution. Say, well, we're not actually racist. Of course, there's nothing racist about clarifying the facts here. The Labour government are the ones who've said that we're going to have ethnicity reports by the end of this year on certain crimes. So they're clearly not, they're not shying away from this on that. But again, sort of giving into pressure after the report that you referenced from the Telegraph FOI on the Ministry of Justice data about sexual offences that came out in the last few months. So, it was a real shame, and it did disappoint me, but I don't really know what I was expecting.
Well, no, I think if you're writing a 197-page report where you're laying bare the fact that the British state has been engaged in a culture of denial, a culture of cover-ups, all along, and you're sort of clarifying the issue in ways that do not redound to the benefit of certain politically correct narratives, it is almost obligatory to give the far right a kick, the so-called far right a kick while you're doing so. Otherwise, you're seen to be picking on a particular community. And I think it's part of this general sort of public relations mentality whereby even-handedness needs to be pursued at all costs, not least to keep community relations and community cohesion in place and all the rest of it. But yes, there is one point in the report where she says the failure of mainstream politicians to tackle this issue has been particularly bad because, and to be fair, she does say also because of the raping. Like that is one reason why it's bad.
It's not quite the
Norm
Macdonald
Macdonald,
joke,
as Norm Macdonald,
but it's getting there.
But she says, and also it means that I think she says groups with divisive politics are waiting in the wings to take advantage. I just don't think that's true. I don't think there are people who, in abstraction from our experiment with diversity and multiculturalism, are keen to sort of stir up hatred in Britain for its own sake. I mean, a comment that I make a lot, as you know, Connor, is like, where is the... If you think that Tommy Robinson is a problem, and I actually happen to think that Tommy Robinson gets a bit of an unfair shake at times, not least in the media, but if you happen to think that Tommy Robinson is a problem, let's concede that he's a problem in some way. He is, at best, a second-order problem, and it is almost unimaginable to conceive of a universe or conceive of a Britain in which Tommy Robinson is anything other than an anonymous Luton fan, if our political elite had not engaged in this act of demographic treachery in the first place and decided to subject the British people to an unwanted experiment with diversity and multiculturalism. Without that, there would not really be... you might have one or two kooky Hitler enthusiasts in the country, but I don't think that there are people latently in Britain waiting to take advantage of this. What there are groups who often notice this and then go about their activism in ways which may perhaps be regrettable. But she always treats these people as if they exist by nature of their ideology, rather than in connection with certain events that have happened in Britain.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was going to say that. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's steelman her case and use the example of the BNP, which none of us think are credible actors, and some of them are genuinely neo-Nazis. One, where is the prominent presence of the BNP at the moment? It hasn't been for about a decade. They're still quite literally a boogeyman. Two, when they did seize upon these issues, for example, the mother of Charlene Downs meeting with Nick Griffin, it's after she had exhausted every other avenue and the state had let her down, because she believes, with evidence that points to it, that her daughter was abused by a grooming gang, murdered, and had her body minced to kebab meat, and the potential murderers walked free on a technicality. Okay, Hope Not Hate wrote a hit piece on that woman. The state ignored her. Why did they not use their significant resources to help her out? Because you've actually driven her to those exact kind of boogeymen that Louise Casey is concerned about. But those boogeymen, as we already said, are not, one, the primary concern. The primary concern is the crimes and their prevention, and justice being brought to the victims and consequences being brought to those that cover it up. And two, managing the public perception of the crimes and the culprits was the reason this was covered up in the first place. As Casey wrote in her report in 2015, she quoted loads of witnesses that turned around and said, we couldn't talk about that this was the fact that it was Pakistani taxi drivers. We had to say men of a certain heritage engaged in a certain profession, and if you brought it up in council meetings or with the police, you were called a racist. Unfortunately, by managing those public relations expectations, she's kind of contributing to the perpetuation of that chilling effect, which I'm very worried will then infect the inquiries.
But I don't think the existence of the BNP is something that is sort of written into the natural order of things.
No.
I don't think there would be. I mean, can any of us imagine a concrete scenario in which there would be a Polish equivalent or a Hungarian equivalent of the BNP? It's inconceivable. So that's what I mean. She's acting as if, there are just these peculiar people who exist by nature who will want to take advantage of this. No, these people are created by these conditions. They don't exploit the conditions, they are created by the conditions. And I think that's a clarification worth making. Connie, do you think there are any positives that are going to come from this? Vivic Cooper has said it, and you hinted at it earlier, that they are going to now be recording ethnicity data and adopting Louise Casey's recommendation on that more thoroughly. Or do you think that this national inquiry in and of itself will just be another example of the British state marking its own homework or kicking things into the long grass?
I mean, I don't think they'll be able to get away with it, because if that is what they're planning to do, because all eyes are on this. So whatever happens now, people will be extremely interested, because they've said that hopefully within 3 years that's going to, most national inquiries take up to a decade. So it's going to be quicker than other inquiries, and people are so aware of this now. It's you can't avoid it. I don't think, frankly, they'll be able to get away with it, and they'll be under a lot of pressure to fulfill it properly. Obviously, it's a good thing that there's going to be a national inquiry, even if it's not exactly the one that we may have all envisioned. There will still be all that pressure to make sure it's done to the best that they can. For example, including Westminster as one of the places that they haven't included from the offset.
Yes. Yes, I think elaborate on that a bit, because I think that this is one of the things that Dominic Cummings has mentioned, that Whitehall's activities are actually not going to be looked at in any great detail. It's going to be a sort of nationally coordinated series of local inquiries rather than a national inquiry as such. That seems rather concerning.
Well, yeah, of course, the state, at the heart of the state, should be investigated in all of this, because there is, according to journalists, there is credible evidence to suggest that civil servants tried to cover things up. So of course they should be included. I think one of the biggest things that will come out of this, and other things like recording ethnicity data, is the fact that I remember when the Ministry of Justice data came out to do with the ethnicity data on sexual offences, that all of a sudden my lived experience, to use that phrase, suddenly felt that I could point to evidence, rather than every time someone say, but you're just making that up, or there's no evidence to suggest that men from certain cultures are more likely to abuse women or treat women in a bad way. But now we have that evidence to show actually culture really does have an impact, and the facts show it. I actually got in a spat with a Harry Potter member of cast.
remember
Do you remember?
that. Yeah.
What was his name?
He was the guy that played the prefect, wasn't he?
I don't know.
Of course he was the
ironically,
prefect.
I'm not really a massive Harry Potter
His name's
fan.
Oliver
despite-
something.
Yeah,
isn't
he's
it?
like one of these sort of millennial blowhards.
and he
isn't
suggested that the fact that I was pointing to the fact that Afghans came out on top.
Finally.
and
It's one way- it's
I
one
know,
way to-
crazy,
one way
isn't
to put
it?
it, yeah.
And he was suggesting that there's a load of data that can't be right because not all rapes are reported, and actually there's institutional racism in the police. But obviously they were ridiculous and flawed arguments.
Sure.
But for many people up and down the country, especially women who have had experiences like this a lot and consistently and often, it's almost like a vindication to be like, well, you can't argue with what the government... Are you going to ignore what the government... Because they're all happy to point to Home Office reports that are now proven faulty to say, well, this said that, so you must be lying. But it's like, well, so do you think this is faulty just because it doesn't line up with what you want to be true? So I think having the inquiry, obviously, hopefully bringing justice for the victims, and also vindicating people who have been speaking about this for a long time will also be an excellent thing that comes out of this, hopefully.
We should mention as well, so obviously you work and have been working, I think, for a week or so now, as the External Affairs Officer of the Free Speech Union, which our viewers are well aware of, and does very, very good work in this country. There are sort of two types of arguments that people make for free speech. Some people make an argument for free speech on the basis of some rights to autonomy. But in my view, a more effective one is the fact that you can't really get to the heart of issues that are plaguing your society unless people... It's a kind of an instrumental case for free speech. It helps you to get to the heart of things, to the heart of matters. How is Labour to be trusted conducting a national inquiry of this kind, long overdue, while jointly pursuing a new Islamophobia definition law, which I think is still proceeding ahead? I mean, I think they're seeking evidence for it at the moment. Dominic Grieve will be chairing it all that. How do you expect they'll manage to walk that tightrope?
Well, it is quite concerning and sort of eerily ironic that on Monday, the day that the case report came out, the government tried to keep it quiet. The fact that they're launching this new working group to create a non-statutory definition of Islamophobia so that the government can better understand what is unacceptable treatment of Muslims. But obviously, in the past, when Yvette Cooper came to office, she said she wanted... before that, the Labour Party had adopted the 2018 APPG definition of Islamophobia, which included... not sort of discrimination on the basis of perceived Muslimness. So that meant that someone who wasn't Muslim, who was perceived to be Muslim, could still be a victim of Islamophobia. Yes. And it also said, as one of the examples in the guidance, basically they suggested that it was a myth that Muslims were involved in, or disproportionately involved in, grooming gangs. And they adopted that definition. Yes. And then when Yvette Cooper took office, she said that she wanted to make non-crime hate incidents easier to record to do with Islamophobia. And ironically then, there at the time, I can't remember his name, but it was a member of the House of Lords who was the faith minister, said that that definition was incompatible with the Equality Act, not about sort of free speech or anything to do with that,
God, no.
but the fact that... he said that religion was not about race in the Equality Act. It's obviously a belief system. Despite that intervention, this year Angela Rayner has sort of pursued a new definition of Islamophobia, which still suggests that you cannot criticise Muslimness or Muslim practices, perhaps. And if it was to become law, we'd be in a position where ex-Muslims might not be able to criticise their past religion. Obviously, we know the danger that can come with leaving Islam in the first place. And the people that are on this working group are people in the past who have expressed concerns about suggesting that Muslims have a disproportionate involvement in grooming gangs, and the media coverage that gets. And yet Dominic Grieve, who's the chair, he was the one who wrote the foreword to the 2018 APPG definition. So these are people who have been involved in a very concerning definition of Islamophobia that was created, and now they're doing it again. And this working group that's been set up, obviously the definition of Islamophobia will affect the way that people can speak about things, obviously to do with the grooming gangs.
Indeed.
General free speech anyway. We have people being prosecuted for burning the Quran, which is not illegal. So yeah, it is really concerning, and it's ironic because it's almost as though if this continues, and the fact that they haven't invited the FSU to go and speak at this. We don't know who else hasn't been invited, but we know the members of the board have this history. So hopefully they will be consulting many different stakeholders, people who are concerned about free speech, the secular society, for example. Otherwise, we could be in the most peculiar situation where the government have said that they're not going to shy away from this, but also you might find yourself in a bit of trouble if you say the wrong thing.
Well, the person who might find themselves in the most trouble is the chair of this new national inquiry. If they do too good a job, they might find themselves having a non-crime hate incident lodged against their name for falling afoul of this new APPG Islamophobia definition, Connor.
Yeah, it's quite worrying as well. So members of the board include Carrie Asim, who is a imam at a Leeds mosque, and he's actually a trustee of Hope Not Hate's charitable trust. And Hope Not Hate were the ones who did the polling for the APPG report, who also put out a paper with Dame Sarah Khan right before the end of last year, I think it was December, where they listed Islamophobia as another example of extremist beliefs. Of course, under Sarah Khan's watch and her sister Sabrina Raiku at the Home Office, they grew the size of the Islamic network, who said that Prevent was innately racist because it focused on Islamic extremism. The same civil servant who said that in a seminar, by the way, then pointed and laughed at an ISIS propaganda video going, "Oh, I recognise that guy, he went to my school." So that's fantastic. Really glad that we've got those people in there. And they produced a report commissioned by Yvette Cooper after the Southport protests last year. It was the Rapid Analytical Sprint that said that the grooming gangs were a right-wing extremist grievance narrative being invented and exploited by the same types of people that Louise Casey might be concerned about. And another person on the board, if I remember correctly, is a baroness who leads the, I think it's Muslim Women's Forum, that wrote the 2013 paper that the Home Office had cited as the only mention of Muslim, and it concluded that the grooming gangs is basically a myth, despite interviewing young anonymous Muslim boys who had said, well, we've watched pornography and we've seen white girls walking around wearing immodest clothing by Islamic standards. They're basically slags, they're basically asking for it, and they run to their parents and scream rape, so it's not our fault. So they had anecdotal data documented from these communities being very honest about their attitudes, and still wrote it off as racist anyway. So no, share all your concerns.
Okay, so this does not then invalidate the need for Rupert Lowe to continue pursuing his own privately fund, or what's the word I'm looking for? Crowdfunded
yes.
National inquiry. I think it's worth mentioning to viewers what the parameters of this national inquiry are going to be. So I think it's going to be a 3-year-long national inquiry, and they are going to have subpoena power, so it is going to be put on a statutory footing. That seems like a good thing. Louise Casey said in the past that the reason why she didn't support a national inquiry in February but does now is because her audit, or the field work she did in the course of putting together her audit, made it clear to her that local investigations, which the government had said would be enough, were faltering precisely because they didn't have that sort of statutory footing. So it is going to be legally reinforced. It's going to be 3 years long. They're going to be seeking testimony not just from members of the British state, whether it's local government or not so much central government, but local government, but also from victims and survivors. What is lacking?
So Maggie Oliver spoke to the Daily Telegraph's podcast on Tuesday, saying that she has faith in Louise Casey because she had her bring a bunch of survivors to talk to her and contribute to the national audit, but she's worried that the state are not going to use those statutory powers enough to prosecute people that help with the cover-up. So Maggie Oliver's also brought forward a judicial review that just so happens to have been brought forward on the same day as the Casey report. So that's my concern, is that and that's the reason Maggie's brought the judicial review, is that civil servants, local councillors, social workers, police officers, etc. will not be sufficiently interrogated and will not face charges, as Chris Philp has said he wants to bring. And then the other concern is the reticence of racial hatred and religion, specifically Islam, as a motivating factor in these crimes. And Maggie Oliver herself said on the Sky News interview yesterday, at the time of recording, that in all of the cases that she's reviewed, of course, it's predominantly Pakistani, but there's also, Eritrean, Afghani, Iraqi, Iranian, and the only thing binding them together is shared faith. So it is a compounding factor. I don't think the government's going to want to look at that for reasons that we've already said. And Rupert Lowe's private inquiry is doing that. It's going to make all of the data publicly available. It's going to take submissions from a wide range of people. And so it will be able to hold the government's feet to the fire if we can see that they're not looking at that.
I think, let me just get it up because I want to do it justice. So Sammy Woodhouse, who is one of the victims from Rotherham, a very courageous woman, is on record saying, I of course welcome anything that is going to tackle this problem, but I have heard all these promises before. I feel I'm living in Groundhog Day. Reports come out, politicians jump up and say how terrible it all is and how things must change, but nothing ever happens. Is she right to be cynical about the announcement of this national inquiry, do you think, Connie?
I mean, I completely understand her as a victim saying that. I mean, any victim, you can completely understand why they would think that. I guess we just have to hope. I can't really comment because I could never put myself in her shoes.
Sorry, I'm not asking you to disagree publicly with Survivor. I just mean, do you think that? Are you optimistic? Let me take Sammy Woodhouse out of the picture. Are you optimistic about the parameters of this public inquiry, and do you think that it will lead to measurable and salutary change in Britain?
I'm optimistic mainly because, regardless of what the parameters are, they simply will not be able to escape scrutiny because it's going to be such a short inquiry relative to others, and the fact that journalists are more than just a couple now are looking at this issue. They won't be able to escape it, and the fact that both Reform and the Tory party are hot on this, they can't escape it. And yeah, it will be interesting to see how much it sort of dominates the rest of their parliamentary time before the next election.
You just mentioned the next election. It's only just occurred to me that given that we're now in 2025, that means that the results of this will be coming out around 2028, 2029, which will hopefully mean that this issue doesn't fade. Well, it probably will fade because that's the nature of the news cycle, but hopefully it will have renewed salience at the time when it matters most at the next election. And MPs, many of them complicit, at least in a culture of denial, are up for election. Connie, thank you so much for joining us on Deprogram this week. Please do stick around, and we're going to talk about your experience of cancellation in Leeds for your gender-critical views. We're going to talk about that with our extra members, so do stick around for that. Connor, thank you very much. As ever, if you'd like to hear more about Connie's experiences, do consider signing up as an NCF member. You can do so by going to our website. But for now, thank you for watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programmes, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.